Hi, everybody. I'm Harry from Rubicare, where we help organizations unlock radical performance improvements that benefit customers, patients, and employees. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the next webinar in our series on what HCPs value, achieving relevance, and results with account insights. Please help to co-create today's discussion by adding your questions throughout the webinar for the Q&A at the end. We also have the resources section, so have a look in there. The session is being recorded and we'll share it after for you and your colleagues. On with today's event, where I have the pleasure of talking with Penny Gihagoglu. Penny, welcome. There we go. Hi, Penny. Good morning.
Morning, everyone. Hi, Harry.
A very warm welcome. Penny, can you give us a little background on yourself and what you do?
Yeah, of course. First of all, thank you for inviting me this morning. My name is Penny Gihagoglu. I'm a consultant clinical oncologist in the NHS at Coventry. I have been a consultant for the last 16 years and working in the NHS as a clinician for the last 23. I also work in other management roles in the NHS, as previously as clinical director, as Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Coventry, and over the last 5 years as the Chief Clinical Information Officer, which means I deal with digital transformation, electronic patient records, and other innovations that have to do with digital and data. I've got some national roles. I'm chairing the Digital Health Network CCIO Advisory Panel. I chair the EPR network, part of the Healthcare Innovation Consortium, and I'm also the medical director for ICON UK, which is a private integrated clinical oncology provider.
You are pretty busy with other words then.
Yeah, pretty busy. That's the word.
Well, I'm very pleased that we get the chance to dig into some of that experience and the different roles that you have. Can we jump into exploring your reality and the opportunities to improve care? And let's start with your kind of clinical role. So, as a practicing oncologist, where do patient pathways most commonly slow down or split today? Where does it not work as well as it could?
First of all, we need to appreciate that oncology pathways have become more complex over the last few years, in a positive way, because we have got more tests to understand and personalize our cancer care treatments, which means sometimes it takes longer for those tests to come back before we make decisions about care.
Right.
Because of the complexity of the treatments that we have nowadays, which is good, people live longer with cancer, get cured from cancer more frequently because of those new treatments. The pathways have become more complex, and we as clinical leaders need to navigate those complex pathways so that our patients get treatment on time. So that's the context. In terms of where things can get delayed is across multiple steps in those pathways. Let's not forget that cancer care is multidisciplinary. There are many professionals involved in the care of those patients. Surgeons, oncologists like myself, radiologists, pathologists, and specialist nurses, physiotherapists, you name it. There's a whole multidisciplinary approach, which is the right thing. So the communication between the clinical professionals is paramount. And of course, the data flow across the different steps on the pathway, from the patient seeing the GP to being referred to a surgeon, to be referred to an MDT, which is where we make clinical decisions about patient care, to be seen in clinic and be referred for treatment. You can see how many steps there are there in the process and where delays can arise in every step. So what do we need to do as leaders is, first of all, appreciate those complex pathways, break them down and make sure we remove any waste that's unnecessary, get the patient to treatment at the right time with the right clinical professional, and ensure we've got all our results of this patient ready. I think data and IT interoperability of digital records, it's a barrier at present. And I think the delays in getting all the information together is one of the key reasons why things delay in the process. Of course, there is capacity, treatments like chemotherapies, we need to be able to have a chemotherapy chair for that patient for the whole day. Or radiotherapy machines, they have to have capacity to accommodate those patients. And where we see delays in some areas is actually having access to that capacity, so access to treatment. And of course, we can talk about, the fact that access varies depending on the areas in the country. And if we go down into a population level, some patients do not want to travel, and access to treatment can be difficult at times. Again, we as clinical leaders, as management, we need to ensure that we offer equitable care to most patients, to all if we can.
You talked about, I mean, there's so much in that. You talked a bit about the communication and the data flow. In practice, what does that look like in your trust? So somebody presents at primary or probably primary care. What then happens? How does that data move through the system for a cancer patient?
Yeah. I'll speak about my trust because we are quite fortunate, and I've led the implementation of our electronic patient record a couple of years ago, which has really helped a lot in having all the information in one place. So what happens is the GP will send a referral, the referral will be picked up through the EPR, and patient will be booked into an urgent cancer clinic. And then onwards, after the surgical review and the initial tests, the patient will be discussed at our cancer MDT, whichever the specialty. We've got cancer MDTs for every cancer condition in our trust and in others. And then the patient will be seen by either surgeon to have a surgery or oncologist to have the chemotherapy, radiotherapy. But the important thing is to gather, as you say, that the collection of information, and that data can sometimes be from different sources. So, for example, some specialist tests of the tumor that we sample may need to go to different laboratories in the region, or even down to London sometimes if we need some specialist advice. So ensuring that the results come back to our electronic patient record is visible for the teams that see the patient and care for the patient. And we make decision on the whole picture of the condition. And we achieve that every week, but it's remarkable how much effort it's needed to actually get to the point.
So you've described a picture where the complexity or the potential delays or impacts on treatment are coming from the communication, but access to treatment, to beds, chairs, the coordination between all the different stakeholders and so on. What about let's move on to well, how do we, the improvement and change around that? And and decisions around that improvement, actually. So if we think about when you started moving into your senior digital roles or senior leadership roles in general, what surprised you about how decisions are made at the system level to make those kind of improvements?
I guess one of the areas that is challenging is siloed pathways. And, part of the organization and acute trust does X, then primary care does Y, then when the patient gets discharged, gets picked up by others. And is connecting those dots is the important bit. So to give you an example, because I like to actually illustrate what I mean, given the complexity of the pathways now, one of the main focuses of the government is actually to move from hospital to community. And for less complex care, patients will value being closer to where they live and also being able to continue their normal life on maintenance treatment. And that needs a lot of leadership at system level as well as organizational level. How do we move less complex care closer to home? And who needs to be involved? Who are the stakeholders that need to support those patients to get back into their productive lives whilst having maintenance treatment? And I think collaboration here is key. Clinical leadership is absolutely key because we are closer to the patients. We can understand their needs. They tell us what's working and not working. And then we need to take that clinical leadership and translate it into the management team to actually say, what is the problem that we are trying to solve? We want to do this. We want to change and move these less complex treatments in the community to free up more complex capacity in the hospital.
Right.
So we need to have a really strategic plan and operationally executed really well so that the patient's care is safe in the community. And to do that, we need collaboration with industry, which we are already doing at Coventry. We need our data systems to link back again into the data flow. And we need that communication between community and acute care. And how does continuity of care back to the GP gets obviously and transferred. So you can see those complex pathways that need to be linked, and clinical leadership and is key in making that link.
You mentioned the industry collaboration, and the people joining us today are largely from industry and really care about how they can help improvement in the healthcare system. So, from your perspective, kind of inside the healthcare system, what does genuinely helpful partnership look like for you in practice?
First of all, there is not going to be practice without partnership, okay? We are living in an era where whether it's digital or whether it's clinical care that is digitally enabled, we need as clinical and operational teams to actually partner. And what good partnership looks like is adding value to the patient journey. And we need then to define what value means. If we think about the aims of the integrated care system is to improve care outcomes, care experiences at reduced cost, and also reduce health inequalities. And I think these are the overarching really goals that we should be aiming, and they're broken down into different, I guess, mini goals that we have to achieve. So when I, as a clinician and as a manager, engage with industry, I like to, this is a two-way relationship. I like to communicate the challenges across the whole pathway, not just one part of it. And I guess from the other side, from industry colleague, it's important to appreciate that whole pathway and look at the benefits of that collaboration as a whole. So what are the benefits for patients? What are the benefits for me as a clinician, for the organization, and for the system as a whole? And then we look at societal benefit and of course measure them.
So say you've got a provider, an industry supplier of pharmaceuticals or tech or something else. What does understanding the patient pathway look like? Like, what do they really need to get their heads around in order to be able to add value?
It goes back into your first question. What are the possible delays and things that can go wrong that will delay patient care or reduce the quality?
Yeah.
Particularly in oncology, we need to be aiming to offer personalized care, which means we need to look at what the individual needs, what they want, what are their values and aspirations, as well as what is the type of disease that we are treating at molecular level, what tests we need, what specific drugs we need. We need to see the patient as a whole, okay? And I think industry colleagues need to move away from the specific area that they cover to look at that patient as a whole.
So rather than, the piece where the products or service that they have developed fits, it's about understanding the whole, of course, where it fits into the patient pathway, but is there an expectation or an ask from you to do more than be the supplier of a single kind of drug or tech-based intervention? Like, what would partnership across the patient pathway look like then?
I mean, if we take a drug in particular, okay, let's say a new chemotherapy drug, we need to think about what tests are available to diagnose side effects earlier
Right.
or predict whether the drug will be effective. You know, that kind of, I guess, exploration around the specific product is important.
Mm.
Or if we are talking about services, if we are talking about, a digital tool that patient can self-monitor in the community, what does that look like? How do we train the patient? How do we train the carers? How does data from that device, which it could be measuring physiological parameters as a result of the treatment we are giving, get back to us as a clinician? That's what I mean by a whole person care.
Yeah, so it really integrates into the pathway, or there's an alternative pathway which will provide better outcomes. Or
Absolutely.
yeah, if we flip it then and think about where well-intentioned initiatives from industry, where do they sometimes create extra burden or friction or disengagement? Like what can go wrong about industry approaches sometimes?
I guess is trying to get a technology or a product in and trying to retrofit it in a
Right.
pathway. I think we have to flip the discussion around and saying, what is the problem in the pathway that we are trying to solve here? And trying to see how can the technology or the product or the service can actually help us. If we do it that way, it's more likely to engage clinicians and to engage managers to say, okay, I've got this wicked problem. How can we solve it together as partners? And doing that, you enter into more a design thinking process where you run a workshop and you listen to the clinical and operational challenges, you discuss different options, and then you say, okay, well, this particular product or service will work well for you. Demonstrated. We have demonstrated. Let's do a pilot. Let's scale it if it works, not just stay in a pilot phase. Let's measure it. Let's PDSA, use improvement methodology to improve it. And that process is really important because it can be embedded then everywhere. And in other systems, it can scale up the product and the service.
I mean, that sounds wonderful to me. And I'm wondering about what is the capacity and capability of clinicians or colleagues in other parts of the healthcare system to do that kind of exploratory work with industry.
Um, well, a lot of people will say there is no capacity to do
Yeah.
this, but I would challenge that and say that if we don't do this, we will never create capacity.
Yeah, yeah,
When we
yeah,
do
yeah.
those exercises and we do them together, firstly, people get very engaged. They see the meaning behind it and the purpose of why they're working so hard, and they can take it and own it back in the clinical, with the clinical teams in clinical care. And when people own something, an innovation that's aiming to improve patient care and staff experience, they become passionate about it, most likely to succeed. And you get the benefits out of it. If we do the same thing and we don't devote time to do those design thinking workshops and implement small changes, nothing is going to change and our capacity will never get better.
Yeah, the investment of the time up front
It will
to say
pay later on.
yeah. And what is an attractive idea to you then? So an industry partner comes and says, look, we really want to collaborate around this. We know this is an issue for patients. We've understood the pathway. What are you looking for in order to say, yes, okay, let's spend that time in a workshop or let's run that pilot? What do you need to feel that this is a worthwhile investment of time and resources?
Um, well, first of all, I would like to understand the value to the patient, the evidence, and where it has worked before, or is that the first time that we are trialing it? I think that's really important. Once we know which one of the two is, if it has been implemented before, how can we learn from elsewhere and bring that into the organization? If it hasn't, then let's start with engaging clinicians to understand the value for them. What's in it for them? What's in it for the patient? Important to involve patients in the process as well, hear their voice. And as I explained, this is it's an iterative process. You use a methodology which we use very well in Coventry to actually do exactly that, go from an idea to an implementation, measure it, and then scale it. That's where I would see value coming out of it.
And whilst you mentioning there that you've got some skill in-house around, design thinking and so on, are you also, looking for potential partners to have that, to be able to kind of manage the process a bit as well? Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the private sector do that more consistently, I would say. So there is a lot to learn from the private sector, from industry regarding that. And we have seen example in our trust how we partnered and we learn from that design process, and we use that now consistently in our practice. And at the same time, industry partners have a lot to learn from us. They have a lot to learn of how we, navigate those challenges in practice. What do we do with our data? And I think the combination of that knowledge is very powerful at the end.
We've been talking a little bit about what does industry need to do and potentially make some changes in how they approach collaboration. What about from the healthcare system side? Like, where do you see the helpful and less helpful behaviors from your wider colleagues there in the healthcare system when it comes to collaboration with industry?
Yeah, I think sometimes we think in the NHS that working with the industry and the private sector is something very different, and it's almost like the dark side. But actually, there's a lot to learn from other industries. And there's a lot that we have learned from other industries, like aviation industry, like human factors. And as we said, the design process and the engineering of how you create something, a service which is new. I think we need to break those silos down, and we as clinical leaders should, own that process, and we should be curious to understand what happens elsewhere. What do other trusts do? What is the private sector doing? And how can we learn? How can we collaborate? And again, as system leaders, we need to take that seriously. We need to think differently. We know that cancer is going to become even more complex moving forward, and all other disciplines as well. We are talking moving into a molecular era, understanding more complex data sets, using AI, protecting patient data. So really the way we work has changed, and working in partnership with the industry can only enhance patient care and make the whole system around the patient stronger.
You mentioned AI there, of course, and I think historically an industry or a company may have approached the NHS with a product, with a pharmaceutical product or with a piece of tech. And that's not enough anymore, right? We're talking about patient pathway change, and more holistic solutions. Are you seeing that change in the industry, that they're bringing kind of a more comprehensive combination of product, service, and other stuff around that? What's happening there?
Yeah, I think the dialogue has started to shift towards a more patient pathway holistic care.
Yeah.
I think what we need to also think about the traditional research type of activity, where it takes about 20 years to get something, a product or a service into a market. I think we need to gradually step away if we can and look at more real world data and use AI to analyze that data. I mean, We see so many patients on a daily basis now. We've got EPR systems which are mature. We should be able to link those data sets, and we should be able to ask the right questions, and make improvements on that richness of data. And the industry can help us with that.
That, I mean, that those kind of that change relationship and change in general. I mean, anything I think that we're talking about here, from bringing a new product or a service or how that industry looks, it's all about change and behavioral change, and that's where we love working. For you, what helps those changes to stick in your trust or in the other organizations that you're working with, so that it doesn't just snap back to what you were doing before?
Yeah, very good question. I think first of all is a very compelling vision that
Mm,
comes really top down. Where are we going as an organization, and how do we
mm,
align our strategy with, the government priorities? That's really, really important. And communicating that strategy is really
mm,
important. Then understanding what are the enablers of that strategy, and make sure that we are reviewing this strategy regularly, because things are moving really fast, as you
mm,
know, in healthcare. The communication down to all levels of the organization is key, because people need to feel part of that strategy. This is not something that it happens in an executive suite and is pushed down. It's something that is actually designed and driven by the organization. And that's what we've done in Coventry. We run a large consultation, and we
mm,
are doing the refresh at the moment, in fact, with our staff, with our patient partners, with our community, to ensure that people buy into it.
mm,
People need to buy into it and understand what's in it for them and what is the
mm,
role in it.
mm. And so and I really hear you about the need for kind of like the compelling vision, feeling high conviction as an individual that you want to change. You understand that the vision that is being painted and the strategy is attractive, it makes sense. And then sometimes the day-to-day gets in the way because incredibly pressured jobs, the demands are increasing. If we look at very practical day-to-day shifts for, staff working in oncology, what needs, what helps them to adopt a different way of working, using a different treatment or whatever it is, in a very kind of on the ground sense.
Mm. Yeah, first of all, for me, is giving people actually the permission to take some time and just step back and
Mm,
reflect. End of the week, beginning of the week, reflect on the goals, on what we have achieved on that week. What does good care look like, and are we actually
mm,
achieving this? It's very easy to get time and pressures. Every day gets by, and then the next day gets by, and then we think
mm,
about, but we don't have time to think about. How
mm,
do we as leaders give that space and permission to people to look at the care they provide and say, are we actually doing what we are supposed to do? What are our
yeah,
patients telling us? Going back into my point of taking space to look at the pathway. So, for example, we've got, even a physical space is important, right? So
yeah,
we've got an innovation hub at Coventry Trust UHW, where we run those days, and I wouldn't call them days off. I would call them strategic days, essential
sure.
days, where we think about what good care looks like, what good communication looks like, what good partnership with the industry looks like,
Yeah, yeah.
and then bringing that knowledge back to the teams. That is what energizes people, and they will go
To
back
what
to the
extent
work.
do you involve external partners in that kind of innovation work?
Where we involve other trusts, we involve primary care, we involve social care, we involve private providers if it's
Yeah.
essential in that particular conversation. Absolutely.
I think we see that the the challenges to improve care, they exist within the healthcare system, and then we have solutions being developed over here, um, based on from a pharmaceutical perspective on what the science. Sometimes these exist in isolation, and then sometimes they interact, but often not very early. So the opportunity to do that ideation, the early phases in the design thinking about, look, these are issues here. How can we even start to think about these rather than, okay, we've got a problem and we expect you to have a ready solution
Yeah,
to solve it.
yeah,
It sounds a bit like that's the direction that you
absolutely.
work in.
That is the missing gap.
Right.
It's that engagement to bring a solution to life is key
Yeah.
because that's how people will adopt it. First of all,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah. Yeah.
how it's
Yeah.
going to be sustained.
Have you had experience of that early collaboration with industry where you still, there's a problem or an opportunity in care, and you're already at that point talking about it before, it's become a big thing, or maybe it's a big thing, but there isn't a clear solution out there.
Absolutely. I mean, a few months ago we ran a workshop with an industry provider looking at a neighborhood health model for oncology.
Right.
So exactly what I described before. How do we take some treatments which are subcutaneous or oral,
Yeah.
and they move into a community setting? How does
Mm,
that service look like? What are the governance that governance framework that we need to think about? The
mm,
data flow, the commissioning bit. It was really successful, and we went live with that service, which is
mm.
run by specialist nurses in the community. And it has started to make a difference.
Amazing. And what partners, and you don't name the partners, but I mean, where were they coming from? What was the background? Who were you working with to bring that kind of a solution to life?
From the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
Of course, their experience, as we talked about, goes beyond that, looks at the whole pathway, and that skill set and enablement and knowledge,
Yeah.
got forwarded to us. And we explored in a day's workshop, and we are now up and running the service. It's really, really powerful.
That's amazing. Um, I want to ask our audience to fire in some questions, and whilst they do that, let me kick you off with one. So, what behaviors would you say from, I suppose, industry partners signal that they really understand your priorities rather than, I suppose, just going through a process?
Um, Understanding of the patient pathway, having
Yeah.
some knowledge of that pathway rather than starting describing it from scratch,
Yeah.
understanding who the key stakeholders are and who the decision makers are,
Yeah.
and then be willing to listen and be willing to work a solution that might be slightly different to what I guess they hoped or planned from the beginning.
Right, right,
Be
right. Yeah.
agile about this.
Love that. So coming to when they approach you, your colleagues, they're really coming having done their homework about
Yeah,
what's going on in the patient pathway, who are the stakeholder groups involved. They have some ideas about a potential solution, but they are, open to being flexible on that so that it genuinely meets the needs that you have and can create value. Is that a
yeah,
fair
yeah.
summary?
That is very fair. Um, and I mentioned before about using implementation science in all of this. So
Yeah.
start evaluating a change from the
Mm,
beginning of that change, not wait until the end to start measuring. Measure the before, measure the after, and put some investment on it, because we
mm,
are good in the UK of ideation, but when it comes to implementation and evaluation, we are less good at. But those small scale projects are a good opportunity to put investment on the evaluation piece.
Wonderful. We've got some other questions coming, and I will say to the participants as well, I've just shared the momentum check on screen, which is a simple diagnostic that helps you see where your team's working with healthcare systems and in other areas might be able to accelerate performance. So check that out. Okay, next question then. Um, okay, looking ahead, what will matter more in the next few years that teams should start adapting to now? So if we think about this, or my interpretation of that is um, the industry teams that are looking to collaborate and also your internal teams, what do they need to be changing in how they're thinking about healthcare now in order for what's
Mm.
coming?
Um, so we know there's a lot of change happening in the strategic commissioning space.
Mm,
Yeah. And I think we're going to see a lot more value-based commissioning in the future. So outcomes-based, essentially. I think we need to start early and now understanding what value means. How do we measure those outcomes? So
mm,
things like patient-reported outcome measures, patient-reported experience measures. I think there will be a time whereby care will be commissioned if we meet those and if we are
mm,
performing well in those. I use the word
mm,
performance, that's probably not the right word, but we are not currently consistently collecting proms and prems.
mm.
But I think that's something that we will come. And if we are ahead of the game and solutions, drugs, services incorporate that, and we can do that digitally nowadays, I think we will be ahead of the game.
Am I right to interpret then that as meaning pharmaceutical companies also need to be presenting data beyond just the efficacy of
Yes,
their
exactly.
drugs?
Absolutely.
And that is that already coming into your decision making?
It's slowly coming in.
Yeah.
Again, I'm currently trying to build an EPROMS solution within our EPR and again, engaging with industry and seeing how we can work that out. It's really, really important.
You said earlier on in the conversation about learning from other industries. How, what have you been able to borrow or be inspired by in how public-private collaboration works in other places?
Um, well, many stories. Certainly, one of the highlights, in my career is working with a private company and using another private provider expert in human factors,
Mm,
because the lead consultant there was an ex-pilot.
right.
So he essentially taught me as a senior leader of that private organization how to think like an aviation pilot when we talk about safety in
Mm.
oncology, safety in radiotherapy processes, checking processes, and what could go wrong.
Can you explain that a bit more? What does that look like?
So there is something around behavior science. When a process you think and you do it every day, it's very likely that a very known process, you're going to relax your controls, right? You're going to say, okay, well, I know this. I don't need anybody to check this. And
Mm,
that's when you relax those controls is where errors happen. And in the
right.
aviation industry, we've got classic examples. So what we did with that company was actually film a complex process within radiotherapy,
Mm,
patient coming in, checking patient's ID, and moving into that process of going into the radiotherapy room, getting the treatment, and coming out, what could possibly go wrong?
mm,
And by using those principles of, you know, checking, double checking, speaking to one another, speaking about the steps that we are following at the time when you are doing it loudly. We've measured and we improved, we reduced significantly the number of incidents in that space, which is sustained many years after that work.
And for the, highly experienced colleagues, potentially very senior, how did they respond to the idea that somebody else checking or using checklists, these kind of tools that are sometimes adopted from the airline industry, how did they respond to that?
Well, that's where the culture of the organization is very important, because in order to do that, senior leaders need to ensure they act as role models on psychological safety, being open about what goes wrong and why without blame is really important, to enable people to come forward and say, okay, let's look into this and do something to change it. I think psychological safety is all over this, and senior leaders need to promote those projects because they have demonstrated immense improvements in how we provide care.
I mean, that's great, isn't it? When you've got those immediate benefits that you can share. We've got another question here. What tends to make something feel immediately relevant versus easy to ignore? And I guess what this question is getting at is if an industry, a company from industry comes and presents something to you, you're doing your initial assessment, what's putting it into the bin or what's putting it into the okay, let's explore this a bit more pile?
That's an interesting question. Well, I will go back into the care principles, right?
Yeah.
If we always have the patient in the middle, in the center of what we do, it is very unlikely that, we're going to go rogue in our decision making. We always need to think about the patient perspective. Is what we are doing going to make care better, ensure patient care is safe, and we're not going to compromise data? I think if we follow those three principles, we can build on those and take, maybe some risks, but without compromising ever patient safety or data.
So there's pretty standardized, essentially, assessment criteria that you're using linked to the principles.
Yeah, I think you need to have some overarching principles here which govern innovation and change. Absolutely.
Yeah. Got a specific question here. When do you look for information on this? So this is Penny is a clinician, I would say. When do you look for information on a pharma website instead of more independent medical information websites? Or we could expand that out into other sources.
Where do I look for information for a specific pharma?
Yeah. So what would lead you to consult the provider of a drug for information versus another source?
Well, first of all, I would say if it's a new drug, then I will always consult that particular provider and understand. They usually have a good summary of the research and the data around it. And I always value, where is that data coming from? Is that data compelling? Because let's not forget, we need to spend time explaining to our patients to help them make that decision, right? So, we often understand it as a clinician, but we're not often thinking how we translate that evidence when we speak with our patients. And when we consent our patients for those treatments, are we actually telling them what they need to know? And is the data compelling? And are we actually being open about this? Because we know some treatments, we don't have overall survival data yet. Do we actually explain that to the patients when they make decisions about treatments? And I think we should.
it is time to start bringing things to a close. What would you like to ask or encourage, the industry partners in pharma and med tech to really think about, focus more on when it comes to adding value to a clinician and a decision maker like yourself?
Yeah. My advice would be, you know your data really well, and you know the background of the research of the drug, if it's a drug or a service. I would say the next step to that is work with the clinical teams and the management teams and look at the whole patient pathway.
Mhm.
Look what other value adding activities around your service or drug would be beneficial to that organization, to that service, and how can we start implementing those changes and evaluating them and sharing that outcomes, so that something good that happens in one area is actually gets spread and other people benefit as well.
Wonderful. Look, Penny, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for joining us. We will be back in the autumn for the next installment in the series. I'll be talking with Anders Morn Frafjord, who is the Deputy CEO of Oslo University Hospital and also Chairman of the University Hospital of North Norway. Once the webinar closes, a short feedback form will pop up. Please complete it so that we can understand what attracted you to join the webinar, how valuable you found it, and suggestions for future sessions. So thank you again and see
Thank you
you
very
next
much.
time. Bye.